All right, welcome to the second breakout session for Unit 2. This is going to cover two topics, carrying capacity and succession. These topics are linked in that they really both revolve around ecosystem change. So succession is intimately linked to the change in the habitat, the environment, but carrying capacity also is a regulation of the organisms in the environment. So helps to kind of dictate who's there, what size of the populations. We're going to dive in first with carrying capacity. So if we take a look at that word, maybe you've never really heard it used before, but I'm pretty sure you can probably break it apart and figure out what it means when you think of, what does capacity mean, um, how much something can hold, and we're carrying or we're allowing or supporting that amount of individuals. And you really get to the definition of carrying capacity, which is the size of the population any habitat can support. And we only look at that for each individual species. So this graph does a good job of illustrating that. In this graph, the population number starts fairly low. Maybe they moved into a new area, maybe there was a disaster, and a lot of the members of the population were killed. But you can see that it grows relatively quickly because there's little competition for resources when the population's low. So they can grow pretty quick, plenty of food, plenty of space. But eventually, as the population grows, there's more competition, there's less space. So the population number begins to level out. And this leveling out is what we would consider carrying capacity. You can see that a lot in this particular graph. This is a classic ecology graph. You see this in a lot of ecology texts where we have the interaction between the lynx and the hare. So predator and prey, and they can actually dictate in that relationship the population of the individual, other individual species. So for instance, when the prey population crashes, you can see when that goes down, the lynx population follows because their food source is depleted. Once the lynx population goes down and there's less predators, the prey have a chance to bounce back. And that's going to allow the lynx population to come back up as there's more food available. So they're helping to dictate each other's population level within the environment, thus playing a role in carrying capacity. What else plays a role? There's a lot of other limiting factors in carrying capacity. Some of those are density dependent, so they're more sensitive when the density of that organism changes. So for instance, space. Space is very density dependent. The more organisms, less space. Whereas something like water availability is not. That's just limited to what is available. So that would be density independent. Sorry, I clicked that slide a little too fast. Okay, the next topic is succession. So if we want to think about succession, we have to think about environmental change. So think about a forest fire sweeps through. Unfortunately, it's a sad reality, especially for a lot of people out west the last couple of years. What is that environment going to look like a day after the fire's gone out, a week, a year, or 100 years later? That process of change and bouncing back from that disaster is considered succession. Okay, so natural disasters are some of the most common reasons why habitats will change, but climate change is causing a lot of variation as well. Remember that temperature abiotic factor plays a huge role in the composition of an environment. So climate change is also causing succession to occur. And other human events like introducing new species by accident. So an invasive species coming into an area can really change a habitat enough that succession could be triggered as well. Okay, so there's two types of succession. There's primary and there's secondary. We'll focus on primary first. Primary occurs after the complete destruction of that habitat. There is nothing left but bare rock and really crummy soil. So think about the lava flows in Hawaii recently. So when that lava cools, we have nothing but bare rock. There's no soil, there's no plants that are going to grow there right away. Primary succession is going to occur in that area. We're starting with nothing. We have to build soil first. So this is the most basic rebuilding. So primary succession begins with pioneer species that come in. They start to grow on that rock. Over time, they'll cause cracks and fissures and breaks. And eventually that rock will get broken up and soil will get created through both the breaking of the rock and the dying that occurs of the organisms that grow on it. And eventually they die and kind of lay down on that rock and something grows on top of them, and that helps with soil production as well. The most common pioneer species for primary succession are lichen. No, not a werewolf. Lichen is actually a relationship between fungi and algae that grow together, and they actually interplay and feed off of each other in a symbiotic relationship, which is something we'll talk about in the next breakout session. And they're one of the most common pioneer species. All right, so here's an illustration of primary succession could happen. So here I've got nothing but rock. My lichens, even mosses can come in and be a really common pioneer species. They'll grow, and this takes a long time. You can kind of see the width of this section is twice as wide as any others because it's a very long process to start to generate soil. And then really short, small plants, flowers, maybe real small shrubs will come in. Eventually we'll get a pretty healthy growth of lower plants. Some trees will start to creep in. They'll shade these out, so eventually a lot of these will die off as the trees take over. And we usually get those pretty fast growing trees first. A lot of coniferous trees grow very, very quickly, pines, things like that, but also aspens grow pretty quickly. So those will kind of come in and take over first. And then some of those longer lived trees, those oaks that can live, 100 years, will take over a slower period of time if the environment is right. So it's obviously dependent on the location of the environment. Okay, primary succession is not as common as secondary succession. It's much more likely to have a flood or a hurricane, a tornado, or a fire. And why is secondary succession different? Well, because we have soil to work with. We already have that soil. In a lot of cases, these events actually enrich the soil. It's kind of hard to think about a fire being good for the environment, but it really can be. When that fire goes through and burns all that wood and debris and plant material, a lot of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus are left behind from that burned material. So what grows back can really establish very quickly and can grow really, really well in that nutrient-rich soil. So secondary succession, because we don't have to build soil, is much faster than primary succession. So here's a great example of that. We've got the forest fire occurring. Our pioneer species are really going to establish themselves well in just a couple of years. So grasses, flowers, things like that. There's a lot of open space. The trees are obviously gone, so there's a lot of sun that hits the soil. And then similar to primary succession, we're going to then add shrubs and eventually trees until we get back to what's considered the climax community, which was the community that was there prior to the fire. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll through just some images, some actual images of what some of these steps could look like. So here's primary succession. We've got a large area of rock with moss and lichen growing on it. Again, this is going to take decades to establish a soil base. You can kind of zoom in and see some of these very small pioneer plants growing on the surface of the rock as we're accumulating small pockets and cracks and fissures in the rock where plant material is degrading and broken down and creating a soil-like structure. All right. Secondary succession, you can kind of see here, if you're paying close attention, we got a lot of stumps. So this area was clear cut, deforestation. So the rebound will occur from there, or we could have a fire. So again, here's an image of after that fire with what's left behind and all the debris on the ground. We've got the soil, and now we have all those charred nutrients in the soil to feed the next generation of plants. You can already see this young pine popping back up, but you still have some of the remnants from that fire as well. And eventually it would come back to, a rehabilitated forest. Another area where we can see succession occurring is in sand dunes. If you've ever been in an area where sand dunes are fairly common, and you can see species that kind of creep in there, but large wind events, flooding can kind of wipe them out and they might have to come back. A lot of these species are well adapted, though, to growing in that sandy environment where a lot of other plants wouldn't survive. And then there are other natural disasters. These are images from a tornado that actually occurred in Platteville a few years ago. So you can see all the trees snapped off and broken. And so this is the beginning. This will be another secondary succession event that will occur here to fill back in this area over a period of time. So we have to think about succession. We focus a lot on plants because until the plants are back, the animals can't come back in. They don't have homes, they don't have food. So the plant species really have to reestablish before the animal species can. And obviously, naturally, the herbivores would come back before carnivores, and they're all going to kind of be a cascade effect on each other for the results of getting succession completed and back to that climax community. All right, hope this helps. Remember, you have more resources available to you and that student overview and resources document that I shared with you in the materials section of Google Classroom, which has other readings and videos that can help you out with succession and carrying capacity.